The ship sat in the dark water of Dock 7, like something that had no business existing. It was too long, too wide. The hull was wrong, not the smooth white curves that every other space-faring civilization had settled on after centuries of refinement. This hull was flat in places and angled in others, like someone had built it angry and never went back to smooth the edges. 3 massive engine bells at the rear, 2 secondary arrays on each flank, gun ports that hadn't been opened yet, sealed under panels that most visiting engineers had assumed were just armor plating, because who in the known galaxy needed that many gun ports on a single vessel? The dock workers called it the Beast. Its official designation was UES Harbinger. Prototype Class 01. The United Earth ship that had eaten 17 years of classified budget. 6 directors of the Global Defense Initiative. 1 very loud international scandal about misappropriated funds, and the careers of at least 4 politicians who had asked too many questions about where the money was going. Commander Elena Vasquez stood at the observation window above Dock 7 and looked down at it. She had a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She hadn't noticed she was looking at the Beast the way a person looks at a thing they built with their own hands and never quite believed would come together. Way a sculptor looks at the finished piece and still can't find the seam where the work ended and the miracle began. They called again, said Director Malik's Chen. He came to stand beside her at the window, a tablet tucked under his arm, the kind of tired sitting deep in his face, not the tired of a bad night, the tired of a decade. Empire's ambassador wants a formal response to the ultimatum before 48 hours. I know, Elena said. The council is meeting in 3 hours. I know that too. Chen looked down at the ship. He was the 6th director. He was the one who hadn't quit, hadn't been fired, hadn't asked too many loud questions, just the quiet ones in the right rooms to the right people. He had kept the funding moving for 9 years. He had gray hair he hadn't had before the project started. He had a way of standing very still when he was frightened that most people read as calm. They sent the full count, he said. 412 ships. The verification satellites confirmed it this morning. Elena finally took a sip of the cold coffee, made a face, said nothing. 412. Chen repeated like the number might mean something different the second time. I heard you, Elena. Malik, he was quiet for a moment. Below them, 2 dock workers in orange suits were running a final calibration check on the Harbinger's port secondary array, walking along the hull with scanner wand small against the ship's flank, like ants checking the leg of a sleeping horse. The council is going to want to know your position, Chen said formally. My position is the same as it's been for 3 years. She set the coffee cup down on the window ledge. We built the thing. Let's use it. 40 years before Elena Vasquez stood at that window, humanity had gotten its first confirmed signal from beyond the solar system. Not a probe, not debris, a message. Deliberately structured, unmistakably intentional, transmitted on a frequency that required a civilization to know what a frequency was before they could use it. The message said roughly translated, we know you're there, don't do anything yet. It took humanity 18 years to figure out who we was, the interstellar dominion, which humans quickly shortened to the Empire because no one wanted to say Dominion without laughing was the Dominant political body of the known galaxy, 41-member species, 17,000. Inhabited systems, a military force that had ended 3 wars in 2 centuries, none of which had lasted longer than 8 months, because nothing the losing side could touch what the Empire brought to the table. They had faster than light travel, humanity did not. They had energy shielding, humanity did not. They had weapons that fired coherent beams of accelerated particles at ranges that made distance a joke. Humanity had nuclear warheads and chemical propulsion, which the Empire's first contact team had examined with the exact kind of polite, suppressed amusement that a professor shows when a child explains how they think electricity works. The first contact went fine in the way that a job interview goes fine when both parties know the applicant is underqualified and the job will not be offered. Humanity was granted observer status, not membership, not alliance. Observer status, which meant that Earth got a seat in certain rooms, got told certain things that were going to happen, and got to watch while they happened. The Empire built a relay station in the outer solar system, assigned a small diplomatic team to orbit, sent a trade delegation every few years to see if Earth had produced anything worth buying. Mostly the Empire was watching to see if humanity would do something dangerous before it had the power to be truly dangerous. The answer for 30 years was no. What humanity was doing quietly and without filing the relevant disclosure reports with the observer status charter was reading everything the Empire had ever published about propulsion, shielding, and weapons technology, studying the design philosophies of 20 alien civilizations, taking notes, arguing more, having very long and very loud conferences in bunkers under 3 different mountain ranges on 3 different continents, where the engineers and physicists and weapons designers sat across tables from each other and took every concept the Empire had ever made public and asked, what would we do differently? The Empire built energy shields that absorbed incoming fire and re-radiated it as heat. Humanity looked at that and said, what if instead of absorbing and re-radiating, the shield disrupted the coherence of the beam at the point of contact? That was a different question. It led to a different answer. The Empire built particle weapons that fired along a single coherent axis. Humanity looked at that and said, what if you fired on multiple axes simultaneously and let the interference pattern do the damage? Another different question, another different answer. The harbinger was what happened when humanity took 30 years of different questions and built them into something. It was not elegant, it was not refined, it did not look like 41 civilizations worth of accumulated aesthetic sense. It looked like humanity had built a ship. Angry, the council met in a room under Geneva, 47 people in a room designed for 30, which said something about how many extra eyes wanted to be in the room for this particular conversation. Elena sat at the far end of the table. She had changed out of her dock clothes into her uniform, which was dark blue, with a single silver stripe on the collar, simple because she had designed it that way and because she had always found medals on military dress uniforms to be a kind of lying. The council chair was a man named Burkov, who was calm in the way that competent bureaucrats learn to be calm when they know the room is watching them. He laid out the situation in clean, unordinate sentences. The Empire had delivered its ultimatum 7 days ago, formal language diplomatic. Phrasing, but the meaning was not. Dressed up, Earth had been building military technology in violation of observer status regulations. The Empire considered this a threat to regional stability. Earth had 48 hours, now 26 hours, to formally disarm and surrender the Harbinger for decommissioning, or the Empire's corrective fleet would take direct action. What's on the table, Burkov said, is whether we comply. The room had opinions. Elena listened to them. Some were afraid, which she understood. 412 ships was a real number. The casualties from an orbital bombardment of Earth were a number 2, and it didn't take long to run. Some were angry in the way that people are angry when they have been small for a long time and suddenly feel the possibility of not being small, but aren't sure what to do with that feeling. Some were trying to find a third option, a diplomatic avenue, delay a negotiation, anything that didn't require making the choice that was on the table. After 40 minutes, Burkov looked at Elena. Commander, he said, your assessment. Elena had been sitting with her hands flat on the table, her eyes level. She didn't move when he spoke to her. The Empire sent 412 ships. She said, that's not a police action. That's not a corrective fleet. That is an armada. They sent 412 ships to take one from us. Silence. They're afraid of the Harbinger. She said they've seen the satellite data. They've run their own assessment, and they sent 412 ships, which tells me that whatever number they came up with when they modeled what the Harbinger could do, that number scared them. A man 3 seats to her left, one of the generals who had opposed the project for most of its life, said, or they sent 412 ships because it's an overwhelming show of force designed to end this without a fight. Same thing. Elena said, if they were sure we couldn't hurt them, they'd have sent 20 ships in a strongly worded letter. 412 is what you send when you're not sure. The room was quiet again. My assessment, Elena said, is that we don't give them the ship. We launch. We find out who was right about what it can do. She got the authorization at 300. Not unanimous, not even close to unanimous, but enough. She walked back down to Dock 7 alone. The dock was on minimal night crew, just the essential monitors and one technician at the far end running a heat cycle on the engine arrays. The beast sat in the dark water, hull lights running in low amber standby, and it looked in the half-dark like something that had always been there, like it had grown from the ocean floor, like the water had decided one day to make something with edges. Elena walked up the boarding ramp, and the ship took her weight and didn't apologize for any of it. The bridge was smaller than most people expected. Ships the size of the Harbinger in Empire design had bridges the size of basketball courts, all curved screens, and wide open space, because the Empire ship design philosophy had always favored the psychology of command, the feeling of space, of authority, of a captain standing in the center of a wide room and seeing everything at once. The Harbinger's bridge was the size of a large living room, 8 stations, 1 command chair, central with direct feeds to every system in the ship, hardwired into the arm panels, screens that wrapped around 3 sides, ceiling low enough that a tall person would be comfortable, not odd. It was designed to be worked in, not performed in. Elena sat in the command chair and pulled up The crew manifest, 61 people, the smallest crew ever assigned to a vessel of this class in the history of human space travel, except there was no history of human space travel, so the record was new and theirs alone. She had read every file. She knew where each of them had come from, what they were good at, what they got wrong under pressure. She had chosen all 61 herself. She keyed the ship wide. "This is Commander Vasquez," she said. "We launch in 6 hours. Get some sleep if you can. If you can't, get to your station and run your checks. Either one is fine." She clicked off. Outside, through the dock's high observation windows, the sky above the ocean was still dark. In approximately 26 hours, 412 Empire warships were going to drop out of faster-than-light travel. At the edge of the solar system, they were going to form up. They were going to transmit their final demand, and the Harbinger was going to be there too. Answer it. Alina pulled up the weapons manifest on her arm panel, went through item by item the way she always did, not because she didn't know it by memory. She had it by memory, but because the act of going through it was a thing she needed, a way of standing in the reality of what they had built. 32 primary rail accelerators, 16 coherence disruptors, 6 torpedo tubes loaded with kinetic penetrators that didn't have a name in the Empire's weapons catalog because the Empire had never thought to build them. The shield array, the drive system, the 14 other systems that didn't have public names yet because they had been designed in those underground bunkers and had never left them. She got to the end of the list and sat back. Somewhere in the galaxy's most secure strategic databases, the Empire's Admiralty had a file on the Harbinger. She had no doubt about that. They had observation satellites. They had their diplomatic team in orbit. They had almost certainly collected everything they could. What they had collected was the outside of the ship, the hull, the general dimensions, the dock configurations. They had seen the gun ports, or at least some of them, and made their estimates. What they had never seen was what the guns did. Nobody had. The Harbinger was a prototype. It had never fired in combat. It had never been tested against a real target at real range with a real threat on the other side. Everything that Alina knew about what it could do came from simulation, from range tests, from engineers with very confident voices and very large equations. She was about to find out if the equations were right. She closed the manifest, pulled up the navigation display. The solar system spread out in front of her in cool blue light, all the planets in their slow, patient orbits. Earth a small, warm dot near the center. She looked at it for a long time, then she put the display away and went to get some sleep. They came out of faster than light travel in a formation so precise it looked rehearsed. Was the Empire's fleet had been running this particular maneuver, mass emergence, in tight grid formation for 200 years. 412 ships dropping back into real space within a 30-cond window, spacing themselves at exact intervals, locking their positions before the light from their own emergence could finish crossing the gap between them. It was not just military strategy, it was a statement. It said, "We do not arrive. We appear all at once everywhere you look." The Empire called the maneuver the curtain. It worked. It had always worked. The Harbinger's long reign sensors picked up the emergent signatures from beyond Neptune's orbit, and the bridge screens lit up with 412 Contact points that bloomed in the display like a field of red flowers, all opening at the same instant. Tactical Officer Sergeant Diana O counted them. Under her breath, got to 100. Stopped counting and just looked at Elena. Elena looked at the display. Plot the formation, she said. Already running, Asai said the formation. Resolved on the main screen, a wide arc. Deep and layered the way you arranged ships when you wanted to present a wall that had no edge to go around. Empire's flagship sat at the center. Back the position of command and also the position of maximum protection. Ringed by 3 full destroyer squadrons, carrier vessels on the flanks, fast attack craft seeded through the formation's front line like teeth. It was a textbook corrective fleet. Posture, Elena knew it because she had read every piece of documentation Earth had ever collected on Empire fleet doctrine, and this was Chapter 1, open. The channel, she said. Communications officer, a young man named Tors, who had the specific stillness of someone who had prepared very thoroughly for a thing and was now discovering that preparation and the real thing were not identical, opened the fleet-wide channel, static then a voice. The translation came through the ship system in flat, clean tones, stripped of inflection, which was the honest limitation of machine translation, and also, Elena thought, probably an accurate representation of how the voice on the other end felt about this conversation. This is Grand Admiral Catherine of the 1st Corrective Fleet acting under authority of the Interstellar Dominion. You have ignored the terms of your final notice. You have 1 hour to transmit formal surrender of the vessel, designated Harbinger, and stand down all crew. After 1 hour we will begin. The channel stayed open. He was waiting for a response. Elena leaned forward in the command chair. Admiral Catherine, she said, and her voice went out across the channel and across the gap between them, and across 412 ships that were each bigger than anything humanity had ever put in space before this moment. This is Commander Elena Vasquez of the UES Harbinger. We're not surrendering the ship. A pause. Commander, the Admiral's translated voice had a quality to it that wasn't quite amusement. It was the voice of a man who had delivered this ultimatum before and always got the same result, and he was deciding how much patience to spend on the variation. You have 1 vessel. We have 412. I know, Elena said. We're ready when you are. She nodded to Toss. He closed the channel. Admiral Kieran was 73 years old. In human terms, though his species counted differently, he had commanded fleet operations in 6 separate theaters of conflict across his career. He had overseen the ending of 2 wars and the beginning of 0, which was a statistic he was proud of. He had never lost a ship in engagement that he hadn't accounted for as an acceptable loss. He had never lost a flagship. He stood on the bridge of the IDS Sovereign Will, which was 800 m long and carried a crew of 3,000 and weapons enough to reduce a medium-sized city to craters, and he looked at the sensor reading of the Harbinger on his tactical screen. 400 m, give or take roughly half the length of his ship, single vessel, crew estimate based on the dock observations his intelligence teams had compiled. Somewhere between 60 and 300, the range was wide because the ship's internal layout was not fully mapped, and the humans had been careful about who they let near it. Weapons visible on the hull, substantial for a human vessel. Unknown effectiveness, unknown range. The hull design was irregular enough that the standard targeting algorithms were running slightly wider dispersal estimates than usual, which was noted in the tactical brief and flagged as a minor complication. Minor 400M, one ship against 412. Catherine had fought species that had surprised him before. He respected that. He had standing orders across his fleet that no species was to be underestimated in the first 60 seconds of engagement, because 60 seconds was how long it took to discover what you didn't know, and you wanted to be alive at the end of 60 seconds so you could adjust. After 60 seconds he expected to adjust very little. He gave the order to advance. The Harbinger moved first. This surprised Kieran. A defending vessel outgunned at this ratio did not advance. It held position, tried to maximize defensive advantages, attempted to find some geographic feature, a planet's gravity well, a debris field, anything to narrow the engagement front. What it did not do was accelerate directly toward 412 ships with all power forward. It's moving toward us, his tactical officer said. I see it, Catherine said. Should I hold formation? Let it come. The Harbinger crossed the gap at a speed that was faster than his intelligence brief had suggested it was capable of. Not dramatically faster enough to note. Kieran noted it and filed it and kept watching on the Harbinger's bridge. Elena watched the formation on the main screen grow larger in the way that things grow when you are moving toward them and have decided not to stop. Rain. To lead elements, she said. 40,000 km. Enclosing, Ase said, fast attack craft. On the formation's front edge, shields. Active, all weapons to ready. The sound the Harbinger made when it brought its weapons to full ready was a low vibration in the hull that you felt in your teeth before you heard it. The crew had all felt it in testing. They knew what it was. Knowing what it was didn't make it feel less like the ship was waking up. 30,000, Ase said. Elena looked at the fast attack craft in the formation's front line. Small ships, quick, designed for high speed engagement runs against larger targets. The Empire used them as a first wave. Send them in fast, hit hard, pull back. Let the destroyers follow through into a disorganized defense. Good tactic against everything the Empire had ever fought. A very good tactic. Target the lead elements, Elena said. Rail accelerators full spread. Fire when we hit 20,000. Understood, said Weapons Officer Kara. Ndidi, whose voice was the calmest thing on the bridge. 20,000 km. Fire. The Harbinger fired, and the sound was nothing like what anyone expected. There was no dramatic boom, no shuddering recoil, just a sharp pressure change in the bridge air and a high metallic tone from the hull as 32 rail accelerators discharged simultaneously, sending kinetic penetrators outward at a velocity that was not a number you said out loud in polite company. The Empire's fast attack craft had shields. Good shields. The standard coherent beam weapons of their era were designed to be absorbed by those shields. The energy dispersed and bled off as heat. The shields were built around the assumption that energy had to be managed. Kinetic penetrators were not energy, they were dense metal rods moving very fast. First 3 fast attack craft in the Empire's front line ceased to exist in any meaningful structural sense inside of 4 seconds, not destroyed in the sense of a dramatic explosion, though there was some of that but broken, torn through, the penetrators passing into the holes and out the other side, and taking most of the ship's interior with them on the way. On the IDS Sovereign, Will Kieran's tactical screen updated. 3 fast attack craft destroyed 30 seconds into engagement. He stared at the screen. Report, he said. Unknown weapon type, his tactical officer said. And there was something in the voice that Kether did not like. Shield penetration on all 3. Full. Structural failure. No energy signature. On the incoming, it reads as solid mass. Projectile velocity. The officer gave him the number. Catherine looked at the number for a moment. That's not possible, he said. It was not a denial, it was the honest assessment of an engineer who knew what existing drive technology could accelerate a mass to, and the number he was looking at was on the other side of that boundary. Sir, his tactical officer said. There. Firing again, the second volley hit the formation's second rank, 4 destroyers, not fast attack craft. Destroyers, heavy combat vessels with reinforced hulls and shield arrays that had absorbed direct fire from Empire. Heavy cruisers without failing. The penetrators hit all 4 in a 2-cond window. 2 of the destroyers lost their forward sections, 1 lost main power and went dark, 1 the one that had its shield array at full power and its armor plating oriented toward the incoming fire absorbed the hit, held for a moment, and then the secondary explosion from the compromised shield system finished what the penetrator had started. On every ship in the formation, tactical officers were filing reports that said variations of the same thing. Unknown weapon, unknown velocity. Shields not effective, recommend immediate tactical revision. Catherine got the reports, read them, stood very still. Move the formation forward, he said. Full advance, all ships open fire. On the Harbinger, I want overlapping fields, everything we have. Empire's fleet had firepower that could crack a moon if you concentrated it. 48 remaining ships opening fire simultaneously on one target was not a tactic that left the target room to negotiate. The Harbinger flew straight into it. The Empire's coherent beam weapons hit the Harbinger's shields, and something happened that Kethen had never seen in 73 years of combat experience. The beams did not splash, they did not heat the shield and disperse, they hit the shield boundary, and the coherence broke. The tight organized wave structure of the beam came apart the way a perfect line of soldiers comes apart when the ground gives way underneath them all at once into chaos. The energy was still there, it still hit, but a coherent particle beam that has lost its coherence is a fraction of the weapon it was a moment ago. The Harbinger's hull lit up with impacts, screens on Alina's bridge flashed amber warnings, shield strength dropping, systems registering stress. One outer panel on the port flank reading elevated heat, not 0 damage. The math of 408 ships was still 408 ships, but the Harbinger kept moving. Return fire, Alina said. Torpedoes target the carrier vessels on the right flank. The torpedo tubes opened and 6 kinetic penetrators of a larger class went out and behind them. The rail accelerators were cycling for a third volley, and the coherence disruptors on the Harbinger's flanks were already doing something to the space around the ship that the Empire's targeting systems would take 3 minutes to notice and longer to understand. On the Empire's lead destroyer ID's iron Point the targeting solution for that. Harbinger was clean 1 second and gone. The next, the ship was still there on. Visual, on the sensor array it was. There but the targeting lock, the precise calculated firing solution that every weapon system on every Empire ship required before it would discharge kept sliding, recalculating, sliding again. The weapons officer on the iron point ran a diagnostic, ran it again, reported to the captain that the targeting system was functioning normally, and the problem was that the target wasn't cooperating. The captain sent this report up the chain. It joined 17 other identical reports from 17 other ships. The Harbinger's third rail accelerator volley hit the Empire's formation while Kethen was reading the reports. He looked up from the reports at his tactical screen. He stood there for a moment longer than he intended. He had given this fleet one job that any competent military force in the known galaxy could do: find one human ship, an experimental vessel that had never fired a shot in anger before. Today, take it apart. What he was looking at on the tactical screen was not the beginning of that job getting done. What he was looking at was 16 more contacts gone. One ship, 19 contacts gone in under 4 minutes. He had not adjusted his tactics enough in 60 seconds. He was adjusting them now, and what he needed, what he had not brought, because he had not thought he would need. It was something that worked. Get me the formation commanders, he said. His voice was level. It was the voice of a man who had been surprised before and knew that surprise was information, and information was how you won. He was using all of that experience and all of that discipline and all of that professional calm to stay ahead of the thing that was happening, which was that the Harbinger was not behaving like a prototype. It was behaving like a weapon that had been waiting a very long time to be used. Outside in the dark between planets, the beast was just getting started. Kieran's first tactical revision was the swarm. He pulled the fast attack craft, what remained of them, out of the front line and sent them wide, not forward, wide, arc them around the Harbinger's flanks while the main formation held the ship's attention from the front. Fast attack craft were designed for this: close the distance, fast fire at point-blank range where targeting solutions didn't need to be precise, where the shield stress from multiple simultaneous close-range hits could build faster than the shield array could compensate. It was the tactic that had broken 3 heavy cruisers in the Vashari conflict 9 years ago. The fast attack craft split and ran wide and came around both flanks of the Harbinger at full speed, 46 vessels converging from 2 directions. Elena watched them come on the rear tactical display. Oi, she said. Counting 46, I said, 23 each side. They're fast, I see them. Elena looked at the main display. The formations front line was still advancing, still firing, still trying to pound the shields down from the front. Double threat, front and both flanks at once. It was a good move. She had read about it in the captured tactical manuals. She had planned for it, and did he, she said. Flank arrays. Ready, fire on my mark, full spread both sides simultaneously. The fast attack craft came in. They were very fast. They were 30 seconds from effective firing range when the panels along the Harbinger's flanks opened. The panels that the Empire's observation satellites had photographed and logged as armor plating, because the Empire ship Designers did not put secondary weapon arrays along a vessel's entire flank, because that was not how ships were designed. You put weapons at the bow and stern and perhaps some point defense systems along the sides, but not the panels opened and there were guns behind every one of them. Mark Elena said both flanks fired at once. The fast attack craft had no time to break off. They were already committed, already in their terminal approach, already at the speed where turning was a process that took distance they no longer had. The Harbinger's flank arrays were not the rail accelerators. Those were bow-mounted heavy, designed for long range. The flank arrays were something different, shorter range, higher rate of fire. They had been designed in a bunker in New Mexico by a weapons engineer named Dr. Fatima Akafer, who had spent 11 years thinking about one specific question: what do you do when something gets close? What you did, Dr. Akafer had decided, was fill the available space with enough metal moving fast enough that the available space became uninhabitable. The fast attack craft on both flanks ceased their approach. Some of them ceased everything else too. Kieran's tactical screen updated. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long moment, doing the arithmetic. And what the arithmetic said was that he had now lost 31 fast attack craft and 14 destroyers in under 8 minutes, and the Harbinger's shields were at his tactical officer gave him the red 71%. 71. He had thrown the full fire of his front formation at that ship for 8 minutes and taken its shields to 71%. He had lost 45 ships. Admiral it was. His second in command, an officer named Vest, who had the careful voice of someone choosing their words very precisely. Their shield profile is not degrading at a rate that I know, Catherine said, at our current loss rate. I know what the rate is, Catherine said, still level, still the controlled voice, but something underneath it now that Vest heard and did not comment on. Give me the formation, commanders. I need to speak to all of them on the observation platform of the neutral relay station above Mars. The Empire's diplomatic liaison to Earth, a being named Counselor Esh, watched the battle on the long-range sensor feed with both sets of hands pressed flat against the console in front of him. Esh had been assigned to the Earth observation post for 6 years. He had filed 240 reports in that time, most of which described humanity's slow and unimpressive progress toward becoming a minimally relevant member of the galactic community. He had attended their conferences. He had watched their news. He had eaten their food, some of which he considered genuinely interesting, and most of which he considered a cry for help. He had also watched the Harbinger being built from a respectful distance through the relay station's optics. He had filed reports on it. He had described its dimensions, its apparent weapon loadout, its unusual hull configuration. His reports had been received, processed, and rated as moderate priority intelligence by the Empire's Strategic Assessment Division. Moderate priority. He was watching the tactical feed now and doing his own arithmetic, the same arithmetic Catherine was doing on the other side of the engagement, and arriving at the same place. He opened a channel to the Empire's nearest communications relay and began composing a message to the Strategic Assessment Division that he privately felt they deserved to receive. At high volume, he did not send it, not yet. He kept watching, Because there was something else. Something the feed had just shown him. That he was not certain he had read. Correctly, he zoomed the sensor feed in. On the Harbinger, the ship's shield. Readings were dropping, 71%, 68. The front formation was still pouring fire into it from close range, now as the formation advanced and the shields were coming down under the sustained pressure of nearly 400 ships worth of weapons. Fire, even with the coherence disruption doing its work, 64%. 61. Watched, and then the Harbinger did something that Ash in 6 years of watching humans had learned to identify as distinctly specifically human. It did something that no reasonable civilization ship designer would include in a vessel's systems, because no reasonable civilization would think it was a good idea. The Harbinger accelerated straight toward the center of the formation. Not away, not to the side, not a defensive maneuver of any kind, directly toward the heart of the Empire's fleet, where the destroyers were thickest and the fire was most concentrated at a speed that said either the people inside it had made peace with dying, or they knew something about the next 30 seconds that the Empire did not. Pressed his hands flat against the console, harder on the bridge of the Harbinger. Every screen was amber or red. Shields at 58% and dropping port flank, showing 2 panel failures, engine output nominal, but the heat readings on the secondary arrays were climbing past the comfortable range into the range that engineers labeled with phrases like "not recommended for extended operation." Range to formation center, Elena said. 8,000 km. Oi said, we are inside there. Formation, I repeat, we are inside. They were inside the formation. Surrounded, which was not where you wanted to be, against 400 ships unless you had specifically designed one of your weapon systems for exactly this situation, which Dr. Akefer and her team had, which was why Elena had driven them here instead of away. The collapse array, Elena said, charge it, weapons officer. And Diddy looked up from her console. She had known this moment was coming. She had run the simulation 100 times, had read the specs, had sat in the briefing where Dr. Ofer had explained it with the precise calm of a person describing a very normal thing. She had understood it intellectually every single time, understanding it intellectually and sitting at the weapons console when the ship was surrounded by 400 enemies and the commander said charge. It were 2 separate experiences. Charging ended, he said. Her voice was still calm. She was proud of that. The collapse array was not in the Empire's tactical database. It was not in any tactical database. It had been designed from nothing by humans, based on a principle that the Empire's physicists had described in theoretical papers 30 years ago and then set aside because the engineering required to make it practical was considered too complex, and the tactical application was too situational to justify the resources. The situational application was this: if you were surrounded and you needed to not be surrounded, and you were willing to accept some risk to the ship's own systems to make that happen, the collapse array generated a tightly focused gravitational disruption field that extended approximately 3,000 km in all directions from the ship and lasted for approximately 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, anything within 3,000 km that had a drive system experienced that drive system shutting down hard, not a soft power off, a forced interruption of the drive field. At the hardware level, the kind of interruption that took time to recover from and occasionally took pieces of the drive system with it when it went 4 seconds, 3000 km, everything in that bubble stopped. The charging tone in the hull was different from the weapons. Ready vibration, it was higher. Sustained, the crew called it the whine. Because that was what it was, the whine. Bill, Catherine felt it before his instruments reported it, not through any alien sense, through the simple physical fact that when a gravitational disruption field of that magnitude begins to charge, it interacts with the mass of nearby objects in a way that the inner ear of most sentient species interprets as wrongness, a feeling of the floor not being where it was a moment ago. He had never felt that feeling on a ship before. What is that? He said, not as a question, not as a command, just as words that came out. His tactical systems had no answer. They were looking for an energy weapon. Signature, a torpedo launch, a beam charge. They were not looking for what was coming because they had no record of what was coming. The whine peaked. Fire. Elena said, the collapse array discharged. The silence after it was the strangest thing. Not real silence. The bridge was still full of alert tones. The hall was still registering impacts. Tor was still reading incoming communications that were now all overlapping each other in the same frequency band, but the specific quality of noise that a massive fleet makes when it is firing everything it has at a single target that stopped. Because the ships within 3000 km of the Harbinger had stopped. 47 vessels dead in space, drives offline, power rerouting into emergency systems, crews running diagnostics that were not going to tell them anything useful for another 6 minutes, which was 6 minutes during which 47 warships were not shooting at anything. The Harbinger's shields read 54%. Elena looked at the display. 47 ships stopped. The rest of the formation was outside the field radius, still active. But the geometry of the formation had just been pulled apart. The center was dead, which meant the ships on the edges had a decision to make about whether to push through their own disabled comrades, to re-engage or hold position while the formation reorganized. Rail accelerators, Elena said. Target the stop vessels heaviest first. She did not like this part. She had known it was coming and she had made her peace with it before they launched, but she did not like it. The stop ships could not maneuver. They could not raise their shields to full. They were not defenseless. Point defense systems ran on independent power, and some of them managed to get partial shields back up in the time available, but partial shields against the rail accelerators at this range was arithmetic that ended way. The Harbinger worked through the stopped ships in 2 minutes and 40 seconds when the collapse array's field dissipated and the remaining stopped ships began recovering their drives. 12 of them recovered into a debris field where 17 of their formation mates used to be. Karen stood on the bridge of the Sovereign Will and received the updated casualty report and stood with it for a while. 69 ships gone, more damaged. 116 minutes into the engagement, he had 343 ships left and a Harbinger that was still functional and still inside his formation and still accelerating toward him, specifically toward the Sovereign Will at the formation center with its shields climbing back toward 70% as the fire reduced and the array had time to recover. Admiral Vess again with the same careful voice. At current attrition rates, the formation is not working, Catherine said. No, sir. Spread them. Take the formation apart, individual ship engagements, maximum dispersal, make them chase separate targets. It was the opposite of everything Empire doctrine said. You did not disperse a fleet, you kept concentration of force. Concentration of force was the principle that had won every engagement in 2 centuries of imperial military history. But concentration of force assumed that the enemy could not sit inside your formation and shut off your engines. Vest gave the order. The formation began to spread. Elena watched it on the main display, the tight grid dissolving. Outward, ships peeling off in different directions, the organized wall becoming a scatter. She picked up her coffee cup. It was still warm. She had not thought about the coffee since they launched. They're dispersing, Oi said. I see it. What do we do? Elena drank the coffee. Set the cup down. We go after the flagship, she said. Everything else will follow. Oi looked at her. So did Tour. So did and Diddy from the weapons console. Because if you went after the flagship was where the Admiral was. And the Admiral, now that his formation was coming apart, now that his numbers were wrong and his tactics were wrong, and everything he had brought to this fight was not the right tool for the job, the Admiral was going to do one of 2 things. He was going to find something that worked, or he was going to run. Elena was betting on run. She needed him to run because she needed the rest of the fleet to see him do it. Set course for the sovereign will, she said. Full power. The Harbinger turned in, went after the biggest ship in the Empire's fleet, and behind them on every screen, the scatter of 343 warships watched it come. And somewhere in that scatter, on the bridge of the biggest and most protected vessel in the corrective fleet, Grand Admiral King looked at the sensor reading of the Harbinger bearing down on him and felt, for the first time in 40 years of command, something he did not have a name for. He had a name for it by the time he gave his next order. The name was run. Keene did not call it a retreat. He called it a tactical repositioning. He transmitted the order to Vest in the clip-precise language of a commander who has made a decision and needs the decision executed before the thinking behind it can be examined too closely. He needed distance from the Harbinger. He needed to get the sovereign will outside the range of whatever the disruption field was, recalibrate his targeting systems, and reassess the engagement from a position that did not have a 400-meter problem bearing down on him at full power. Tactical repositioning. Vest repeated the order. Without comment, the sovereign will turned. It was a big ship. Turning took time. In that time, every vessel in the dispersed formation, 343 ships scattered across a volume of space the size of a small country, received the same sensor data, the same image on their tactical screens. The Empire's flagship, the largest and best protected vessel in the corrective fleet, turning away from one human ship. Nobody said anything on any of those bridges. Nobody had to. Elena watched the flagship turn on the main screen. There it is, she said, not to anyone in particular, to the room, to the ship. The Harbinger felt different in that moment, or maybe she felt different, which was the same thing. When you had been in command long enough that the boundary between yourself and the ship blurred in ways that were hard to explain to people who hadn't sat in this chair. He's running, Asa said, and Her voice had something in it that wasn't quite disbelief. It was the sound of a person watching something they calculated was likely and still not quite believing it when it happened. He's repositioning, Elena said dryly. And did he made a sound, not a word. Just a sound. Maintain pursuit, Elena said. Keep him running, don't fire on the flagship yet. Tour looked up from communications. Commander, we're getting hails from 14 separate formation vessels. They're requesting, it looks like they're requesting ceasefire terms. Elena looked at him. 14. 15 now to said she had known this was possible. She had briefed it as a possibility. The logic was clean. Fleet's morale is tied to its command structure the way a building is tied to its foundation. You do not take down a building by hitting the walls. You go for the foundation. If the flagship ran, the fleet saw the flagship run, and a fleet that has watched its admiral run from one ship has a question to answer. Not a tactical question, a personal one. About what exactly they are still doing. Here, don't respond to the ceasefire hails yet, Elena said. Keep them waiting. Tour open a channel to Earth. Director Chen in the operations center. Under Geneva, Malik Chen had not sat down in 4 hours. He had watched every second of the engagement on the main display. He had watched the tactical count climb, 10 ships, 20, 40, 69, and he had felt something that he could not have accurately named, a mixture of vindication and horror, and a third thing that had no word, the feeling of watching something you believed in for 17 years prove itself in the most brutal possible way. The room around him was silent in the specific way that rooms go silent when everyone is watching something that is larger than any of them, and nobody wants to be the first to speak and break the spell of it. When Elena's channel opened, the room came back to life. Commander Chin said. Malik. Her voice on the channel was level, not excited, not relieved, leveled the way it always was, which was what he had hired her for. The flagship is running. 15 ships requesting ceasefire, 328 ships still active, but the formation is gone. And they're watching their admiral leave. I need you to do the thing. Chen had been waiting for this phrase for 4 hours. He had been waiting for it in a different sense for 17 years. Are you sure? He said. Not doubt, just the process, the check. Do it now, Elena said, while he's still running. While they're all watching, Chen nodded to the communications officer across the room. The transmission went out on every open frequency in the solar system, every channel the Empire used for fleet communications, every diplomatic band, every public frequency. The relay stations picked it up, and it traveled outward at the speed of light, and it arrived at Counselor A's console on the observation platform above Mars before it reached the fleet, because Mars was between the sun and the engagement zone, and Esh was closer. He read it again, then he sat down, which his species did not typically do at consoles designed for standing operation, and he sat there with the transmission on his screen and the tactical feed showing the Sovereign Will running and the Harbinger in pursuit, and 328 remaining warships floating in a scatter, and he felt the specific sensation of a person watching history move. The transmission was from Director Malik Chen, Global Defense Initiative, United Earth. It said in clean and uncomplicated language that the UES Harbinger was a prototype classification 1. The 0 stood for proof of concept. The 1 stood for the first of the class. It included a secondary document, attached, verified, sealed with 3 layers of authentication that would take the Empire's intelligence division about 40 minutes to confirm were genuine. The secondary document was a construction manifest, 7 more ships, each one incorporating refinements made on the lessons of the Harbinger's design, each one larger, each one armed with the systems the Harbinger carried, plus the systems that hadn't fit in the Harbinger's hull. Because the Harbinger's hull was the first attempt, and the teams that built it were still learning, 4 of the 7 were more than 60% complete. The transmission ended with one sentence from Director Chen, which he had written himself at 3:00 in the morning alone in his office 6 months before the ultimatum arrived, because he had always known the ultimatum was coming, and he had wanted to have the words ready. The sentence said, "We have been building, and we have not been idle, and we are not what you decided we were." Catherine received the transmission. He was in the middle of his tactical repositioning, which had covered in the last 6 minutes a distance that could no longer be described as tactical, when the transmission hit his communications array, and his officer put it on his screen without comment, because the officer had read it and had no comment to make. Catherine read it. He had very good control of his expressions. He had cultivated that control over 40 years. Because a commander whose face showed things gave away information, and information was always the most valuable thing on a battlefield. His face showed something now. Vest saw it, did not look away fast enough, saw the Admiral's face do a thing it had never done in 6 years of service. Together, not panic, not rage, something quieter and worse than either of those. The expression of a man recalculating problem and finding that every variable he had built his plan around was the wrong number. 7 ships, Catherine said quietly, almost to himself. "Sir, we sent 412 ships to stop one," Cathar said, "and they have 7 more than one of which is further along in construction than the Harbinger was when we first observed it." Vest said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. "They let us see the prototype," Catherine said. He was not speaking to Vest anymore. He was working through it out loud, which was something he had not done in front of a subordinate since he was a junior officer. They registered it. They let us watch it being built. They filed no concealment orders on the dock. They let us see the one ship in, count its weapon ports, and take our photographs and build our assessment. He paused because they wanted us to bring everything we had against the one they were willing to show us. Tactical display still showed the Harbinger behind them, still in pursuit, not closing the gap, not trying to. Elena was too smart for that. She was keeping the distance exactly where it was, keeping the sovereign will in a controlled run that lasted exactly as long as she wanted it to, but not dropping back either. 328 ships watching their admiral run. And somewhere behind Mars, 4 ships, more than 60% complete. Keeper looked at the transmission again, at the construction manifest, at the attached images of the hulls taking shape in Earth's deep water docks, photographed recently enough that the timestamps would survive authentication. One of the ships in the images was bigger than the Harbinger by a margin that the scale markers made very clear. He thought about what the Harbinger had Done to his fleet today, he thought. About that ship being bigger. He opened the fleet-wide channel. He spoke 6 words that had never been spoken in his career, and that he would have this morning said he was not capable of saying 6 words that would travel at the speed of light out of this solar system and reach the Empire's home systems in due course and arrive in the historical record of the interstellar dominion at a volume that would not fade. All ships stand down, hold position, not retreat. He was done pretending, but not advance either. Hold, because he needed to think, and he needed to talk to his command council, and he needed to be in a place where the Harbinger was not closing on him while he did it. The fleet held position. The Harbinger held position. The solar system went quiet. On the relay station above Mars, Counselor Esch was composing a message, not to the Strategic Assessment Division. He was done with the Strategic Assessment Division, who had rated his previous reports as moderate priority and could now file that rating somewhere. He was too professional to specify. He was composing a message to the Imperial High Council directly. 7 members, the governing body of the interstellar dominion, the people who had authorized this fleet in this ultimatum and had signed the order that sent 412 ships to collect 1 human prototype. He was trying to write the message in the careful, neutral, diplomatic language that his training required. He had been trained for 20 years to write in that language. He had always been good at it. He was having difficulty. What he wanted to write was, "You have made a mistake of a type that does not unhep." What he wrote instead was a precise accounting of the engagement, the current fleet status, the content of Director Chen's transmission, and a formal recommendation that the High Council consider opening direct diplomatic communication with the human government before the 4 ships that were 60+% complete were 100% complete. He attached the construction manifest. He sent it at the highest priority classification available to a field counselor, which was a classification he had never used before because he had never been in a field situation that required it. He sat back and looked at the tactical feed. The Harbinger was sitting in the dark between the scattered remains of the corrective fleet, shields at 83% and climbing as the engagement pause let the array recover, hold temperatures dropping back to normal operational range. Still patient, Ash had spent 6 years watching humans, watching their news, their conferences, their arguments, their strange and persistent habit of pouring effort into things that other civilizations had looked at and decided were not worth the trouble. He had watched them build the Harbinger with a kind of polite professional disbelief, not because he thought they couldn't do it, but because he had assumed they were doing what civilizations at Earth's development stage always did, which was build the thing they had been shown how to build. They had not built the thing they had been shown how to build. They had built something else, something nobody had shown them, something they had looked at the existing work and decided they could do differently, and had then gone underground and done differently quietly for 17 years while smiling at every diplomatic function and filing their observer status reports and letting Ash photograph their one visible ship from orbit. He thought about the 7 ships in the manifest. He thought about the fact that the manifest was the document they had chosen to release, not the total picture, The document they had decided at this specific moment to let the Empire see. There was a question underneath that thought that Esh did not want to look at directly but could not stop looking at, which was, if this is what they chose to show us today, what else are they still not showing us? Elena stood the Harbinger down from combat alert at the 4-hour mark, not stood down completely, shield stayed active, weapons stayed in ready state. The crew stayed at their stations, but she cut the full alert status because full alert status burned the crew, and the crew had been burning since before they launched, and she needed them sharp for whatever came next. Whatever came next was going to be decided by what Catherine did in the next few hours. He was going to call home. He was already calling home. She could see the heavy encryption transmission going out from the sovereign will on the comms display, type beam toward the relay network, bouncing toward the Imperial home systems. He was filing his report and asking for guidance and waiting for someone with more authority than him to look at the situation and decide what a situation like this was worth. She knew what it was worth. She had known for 17 years. Chen's voice came through her earpiece. Private channel, High Council is going to want a conversation. Good, she said. They're going to come in hard. They're embarrassed and they're scared, and those are not comfortable things for a civilization that hasn't been scared in 200 years. Good, Elena said again. Elena. Malik, we just showed them what we built. She looked at the main display. The scattered fleet, the running flagship now holding position, the solar system around them quiet. Now we show them what we want. Chen was quiet for a moment on the line. Then the councils already arguing about terms. They can argue, Elena said. We have time. She looked out at the stars, not through a window. The Harbinger had no windows on the bridge, just screens, just data. But she looked at the starfield image on the main display, the way people have always looked at stars when they are sitting in the middle of something large and trying to hold the shape of it in their minds. 328 ships holding position, a flagship that had run a transmission out across the galaxy that said, we are not what you decided we were, and 7 more ships in the water back home growing. The Harbinger sat in the dark and waited, and the dark was theirs. The High Council's response came 11 hours later, not from Kiran, not through the fleet communications array, through the official diplomatic channel, the one that had carried 40 years of observer status reports and trade delegation schedules and politely worded reminders about regulatory compliance. The channel that had always, until this moment, carried traffic in one direction from them to Earth, instructions, assessments, notices. This time it carried a request. The Imperial High Council, governing body of the interstellar dominion, representing 41 member species and 17,000 inhabited systems, formally requested a diplomatic meeting with representatives of the United Earth government at the earliest mutually convenient opportunity. Mutually convenient. Torres read it off his screen twice to make sure he had the translation right. Then he turned to Elena with the expression of a man who wanted very much to say something but couldn't find the words that were big enough. Elena read it herself. Tell them tomorrow, she said, 1,400 hours Geneva. They can use the same conference room they used for the observer status meetings. She had specifically chosen the same room. Chen had asked if she Wanted somewhere larger, more formal, more appropriate to the occasion. She had said no, the same room, the same table. She wanted whoever walked in there for the Empire to sit down in the same chairs where humanity had sat for 30 years being given instructions, and she wanted that to be the first thing they felt when they walked through the door. Torres sent the reply. Catherine began his fleet's withdrawal 6 hours after the stand. Not fast, there was no running now. That it happened once and it would sit in the record, and he could not undo it, but he would not do it again. The withdrawal was slow and ordered, the fleet reassembling into a loose formation and moving back toward the system's edge where the faster than light jump points were, moving at a pace that said, we are leaving because we have chosen to leave, even though everyone watching knew the real sentence was longer and ended differently. He filed his after-action report from the Sovereign Will's bridge while the fleet moved. It took him 4 hours to write a document that was usually 2 pages. Standard after-action format had fields for enemy strength, enemy tactics, engagement outcome, casualties, sustained casualties inflicted. The casualties inflicted field was the problem. The answer was 1 ship, slightly damaged. He typed it and looked at it and typed it again as if the second time might change it, and it did not. He did not redact it. He did not soften the language or find a framing that made the number less true. He had spent 40 years being the kind of officer who filed honest reports, and he was not going to stop because the honest report was the worst document he had ever written. He filed it, then he did something that was not in any standard after-action format. He wrote a separate document, personal, not filed through the official system, addressed to the High Council directly, 3 paragraphs. The first described as plainly as he could manage what the Harbinger actually was, not the intelligence assessment, not the photographs, not the projected capabilities that had led to the decision to send 412 ships, but what he had seen it do over 4 hours of combat, catalogued without drama. The second paragraph was 1 sentence. It said, "The assessment was wrong, and I accepted the assessment, and that is also my failure." The third paragraph said that whatever the diplomatic meeting produced, he recommended the council not enter it from a position of pride. That pride was not a resource they currently had available. He sent it, closed the file, looked out at his fleet moving in its slow withdrawal. 291 ships. He had arrived with 412. He was leaving with 291, and 11 of those were damaged to varying degrees, and all of them had watched their flagship run. He had commanded this fleet for 8 years. He knew these ships the way a person knows rooms they have lived in. He knew the names of the captains. He knew their service records. He knew which of them would have the hardest time with what was in the after-action report, because they were the kind of officers who calibrated their understanding of the world against the Empire's invincibility, and today had unmeasured that calibration in a way that would not remeasure easily. The fleet crossed the system's edge. The jump drives charged. Kieran looked at the sensor display one last time. The solar system behind them, the small warm planet near the center of it, the Harbinger, which had stopped pursuing at the system's midpoint and was now, according to the last sensor reading, sitting still in the dark, watching them go. He had one thought, not tactical, not strategic, just a thought. 30 years They did all of this in 30 years. His species had been spacefaring for 900. The Empire had existed for 200. Every member civilization had come to the galactic community with centuries of development behind them, with accumulated knowledge, with the slow, patient build of a species that had time. Humanity had been watching for 30 years and had made themselves into this in 30 years. He did not know what to do with that thought, so he filed it away and gave the jump order, and the fleet went. The diplomatic meeting was not what the Empire's delegation expected. They sent 3 people: senior diplomatic envoy Tosserus, who was the High Council's most experienced negotiator and had handled the terms of 2 war endings and 1 planetary annexation, and had a reputation for never leaving a table without getting at least part of what he came for. His 2 advisors, they arrived in Geneva at the appointed time and were shown into the conference room by a human aide who offered them water and said nothing else. The room was smaller than Taos had expected. The table seated 12, and there were 3 chairs on one side and 3 on the other. Torres sat in the center with his advisors on either side. Across the table were Director Chen, a legal officer whose name Torres had been given in the briefing, and Commander Elena Vasquez, still in her uniform, dark blue, single stripe. Torres had been briefed on all 3 of them. He had reviewed the tactical footage. He had read Kieran's after-action report. He had come to Geneva with an offer that the High Council had authorized and that Torres privately considered more generous than he would have recommended given the circumstances, because the circumstances were what they were and there was no point pretending otherwise. He laid the offer on the table before the opening statements were finished. Full member status in the Interstellar Dominion, a seat on the Council's outer assembly, trade access at member rates, the fleet withdrawal already in progress, formal acknowledgement that the Harbinger's construction did not constitute a violation of observer status terms, which was a legal reinterpretation that the Empire's lawyers had worked on through the night, and which Torres personally thought was creative to the point of fiction, but it was what they had. It was a good offer. Torres had seen smaller civilization accept smaller offers with more gratitude. Chen listened to the whole thing. Then he looked at Elena. Elena looked at Torres. That's the offer, she said. It was not a question. That is the offer. Torres said, I think you'll find it. We want full member status. Elena said, we also want the observer status framework dissolved for all current observer civilizations, not just us, all of them. Torres paused. There were currently 11 civilizations holding observer status in the Interstellar Dominion, 11 species at various stages of development sitting the waiting room of the galactic community, being assessed, being watched, being given the same polite and suppressed evaluation that Earth had received for 30 years. That is outside the scope of this negotiation. Torres said, we're making it in scope. Elena said, observer status is a system designed to keep developing civilizations from developing in ways you don't approve of. We understand the impulse. We also built 8 warships while holding observer status, so the system does not work as advertised. She let that sit for a moment, dissolve it. Offer membership tracks to all current observers. That's our condition. Torres looked at her, then at Chen. Chen had the expression of a man watching someone else do exactly what he would have done. You're asking us to restructure 40 years of diplomatic framework, Taurus said. We're asking you to stop running a waiting room for civilizations you decided weren't ready yet, Elena said. You didn't decide correctly about us. There's a reasonable chance you haven't decided correctly about some of the others either. Taurus sat with this. He had not been authorized for this. It was not in the scope of what the High Council had briefed him for. He would need to send back to the Council, and the Council would need to discuss it, and there would be factions against it, and factions for it, and the whole machinery of imperial governance would grind through the question over weeks or months. I'll transmit the request, he said carefully. Thank you, Chen said. The meeting ran for another 2 hours on secondary terms, trade protocols, communication frameworks, the formal acknowledgement document, and when it was done and the Empire's delegation was being escorted back to their transport, Taurus stopped at the door and looked back at Elena, who was still at the table gathering her notes. Commander, he said, the fleet. 412 ships. He seemed to be choosing his words. You knew what we would send. We had estimates. Elena said, you let us see exactly what you wanted us to see. She looked at him. You observed us for 30 years, envoy. It would have been strange not to pay attention. Taurus left. The news traveled fast. Not all news traveled fast. The galaxy was large and signals took time, but a corrective fleet withdrawing from a system it had entered with 412 ships and left with 291 was a signal that did not need a transmission. The withdrawal itself was the broadcast. Fleet movement that size left traces in a dozen independent sensor networks. The independent networks talked. The story assembled itself from the pieces raggedly and fast, the way big stories always do. By the time the Interstellar Dominion's Public Affairs Office issued a formal statement, careful language, minimal detail, no casualty figures, the story was already everywhere, and the formal statement was already behind it, in the outer systems, in the civilizations with observer status who had spent years in the same waiting room Earth had occupied. The story moved faster than anywhere else. It moved at the speed of people sending it to each other, person to person, system to system, the specific velocity of news that matters to the people receiving it. It was not just that Earth had fought. Plenty of civilizations had fought the Empire. Some of them had fought well and lost and been absorbed. The fight was not the story. The story was 30 years of watching and learning and building in secret and smiling at the diplomatic functions and letting the Empire photograph the ship. They were willing to show. The story was that when the ultimatum came, they had answered it with one vessel, the one everyone already knew about, and the one vessel had been enough, and behind it were 7 more that nobody had known about until the moment it was useful to know. The story was they were never what we assessed them to be. They were what they were building, and we couldn't see it in 11 different star systems, 11 different observer civilizations read that story. Some of them had been in the waiting room for longer than Earth. Some of them had stopped building certain things quietly when the Empire's observers noticed and filed reports. Some of them had docks that had been empty for a long time. The docks were a long way from full, but the story had arrived, and the story was a kind of permission, and some of those docks would not stay empty. Elena went back to the Harbinger the evening after the diplomatic meeting. She did not have specific reason. There was no launch scheduled, no systems check that required her physical presence. The ship was in Dock 7 under post-engagement maintenance, hull techs crawling over the port flank panels, the engine arrays running a passive cooldown cycle, the weapon systems locked down and logged for inspection, a controlled rest, the kind of thing earns after it has worked. She walked the boarding ramp and the ship took her weight and still didn't apologize for anything. She walked the corridors alone, past the crew quarters, most of them empty. The crew had been given 48 hours, and most of them had gone home, gone somewhere with air that didn't circulate through Militaria filters, gone to be people for a day before they were crew again. Past the weapons bay sealed, the smell of burned metal still hanging faintly in the air. Outside the rail accelerator chambers, past the engine room where two techs were running diagnostics and looked up. When she passed and nodded and looked back down at their work, she went to the bridge, sat in the command chair. The screens were on standby. The main display showed the Starfield image, the same one she had looked at the night before they launched, but from the dock position. It also showed the water through the dock's exterior sensors, the harbor lights on the surface, a narrow slice of sky above the dock's open top. Earth sky. She had spent 4 hours fighting in the dark between planets, and now she was looking at sky, and it was the same sky. It had always been the same specific blue-gray of late evening over water, and it was the most ordinary thing she had ever seen, and she could not stop looking at it. She thought about the document Chen had released, the 7 ships, the manifest with the photographs. She thought about the fact that the manifest was true, the ships existed, the construction percentages were accurate, the images were real. She had insisted on that. No bluff, nothing that didn't exist. The Empire would authenticate every line, and every line would authenticate clean, because the moment you showed them something false, you had spent the one thing you could never buy back. She thought about what Taurus had said, "You let us see exactly what you wanted us to see." 30 years of careful watching, and they had never looked close enough, never asked the right question, never considered that the civilization in the waiting room might be spending its time in the waiting room very productively. They had seen humans building something and assumed they knew what it was. They had not asked what humanity would do differently. That was the question that had always been the question, not can they build it, but what will they build when they decide to build something entirely their own. The Harbinger answered that question. It was not beautiful, it was not elegant, it did not look like it belonged in the same sky as the things the Empire built. It looked like something that had been constructed by people who were not trying to belong in that sky, who were trying to own it. Elena sat in the command chair for a long time. Tomorrow there would be more meetings, terms to finalize, frameworks to draft, the observer civilization sending quiet diplomatic inquiries that the Earth government would have to answer. The whole machinery of a changed world starting to move. Chen had a list of items 17 pages long that needed her attention before the end of the week. Tonight the ship was still, and the harbor lights were on the water, and somewhere above the dock's open ceiling, the sky was the color it always was, the specific ordinary color of the planet. She had taken one ship out to protect. She looked at it until the light was gone and the stars came through, and the stars were the same stars they had always been, and they looked for the first time like something that was theirs.